The early formation of Islam. Introduction. In light of the scarcity of primary sources for the 7th century, and therefore piecing together the events according to the media available to us from that time, Jonathan Berkey concludes that Islam emerged slowly and probably did not begin as anything more than a monotheistic religion of the Arabs shaped through a process of dialogue with Judaism and Christianity. Patricia Kohn also argues for a gradual evolution on Islam institutions as the early Arab community carried out an exodus hijrah from their homeland to the newly established garrison cities on the conquered lands. This hijrah may have been fueled by the promise of a new Arab state based on conquest, rape, and pillage, or it may have been a people movement but the withdrawal of the Byzantine forces and the discontinuation of subsidies to the foederati for the guarding the borders. Highland notes that papyri and inscriptions refer to a certain date given for the Hijrah AD 622, but they do not explain the nature of the inauguration of this movement. Kron believes that this hijrah was an exodus taken by the Muhajirun, or those who were on the exodus to a promised land, but he also concludes that this hijrah was not from Mecca to Medina as in traditional account, but rather than from Medina to the promised land of Israel. She bases her conclusions on the fact that the term Muhajirun corresponds to the Syrian term Mahraye, or those who take part in the hijrah or exodus. The corresponding Greek term Margarite appears in papyrus as early as 642, and the Syriac term Mahraye also appears around that time. Kron writes that there are two notions involved in the use of the term, one linking the Arabs to the Mahraye as descendants of Abraham and Hagar, and therefore also called Hagarenes, but also ascribing to these same Arabs a term describing their participation in an exodus or hijrah, and therefore known as the Muhajirun, or those who take part in this hijrah. The significance of this use of the term is to demonstrate that the Islamic regime did not rise full-blown until much later, perhaps in the time of Abd al-Malik. Therefore, the use of the terms Muslim, Islamic, or Islam would be inappropriate in the mid-7th century. Indeed, in the first recorded use of the term Islam in the inscription is in the Dome of Rock, dated around 691 until 692, while the first recorded use of the term Muslim by a believer is AD 741 and AD 775 for a non-Muslim. The preferred term used by the early Muslims was mu'minun, or believer, is found 32 times in the Constitution of Medina, though most of the 7th century non-Muslim witnesses of the Arab conquest would not attribute any religious appellations to the godless Saracens that they encountered. At this point, some may want to point out that the term Muslim is used 98 times in the Chronicle of John of Nicaea, for example, which is said to have been written around 690. However, the earliest copy of John's Chronicle is from 602. Is from a 1602 Ethiopic translation of an earlier Arabic translation, which, like the original Greek and Coptic manuscript, is lost. Therefore, it would have been very easy to have replaced on the original terms like Ismailites Ismailite or Saracen or Mahgaye with the term Muslim, even though the latter term probably had not come into common usage until the late 8th century. This practice of substitution was apparently often used and is quite natural, for we also tend to refer to the Muslims in the time of Muhammad when the historical date tells us that the term was probably not used until 140 years later.
The early formation of Islam according to the neo-revisionists. What can we say then about the early development of Islam? On the one hand, the early skeptics, led by Wandsworth and Groen, warned to the postulate, in the absence of the documentary evidence, that Mecca was the Muhammad's birthplace, or the Hijaz Islam's house, that the Quran was not compiled in the 7th century or written in Arabic, and even that Muhammad and the Arab conquest were a later invention. On the other hand, Highland argues that Islamic practices, which can be traced through the early non-Muslim sources and documentary evidence, are present early on. There is a new calendar dated from AD 622. The Muhajir appear, written Arabic is used, and the ruler is called the commander of the believers and serves as a god named Allah. Jeremy Jones adds that coins, building inscriptions, tombstones, and travelers' gravity can be used to trace out the early growth and the development of a new religious community. Holland concludes that there is enough evidence to infer that the newcomers did possess a distinctive cult. Indeed, it is significant that the Christians in the 7th and early 8th centuries did not consider the religious beliefs of the Arabs to be a different religion altogether, but rather they view it as more of cult of a heresy of Christianity. This is exactly what John of Damascus, circa 627, 625 until circa 250, concludes in the middle of the 8th century. His portrayal of Islam is that of an outgrowth of the pernicious Christian heresy, Arianism, and his apologetic approach is designed to help Christians deal with Muhammad as a false prophet and the false beliefs of the Ismailites, whom he says will use usher in the Antichrist. Muhammad and the full of Muhammad and the full light of history was knowledge that the Prophet Muhammad 570 632 present from the mid-7th century, or did it gradually evolve along with the religion? A British Muslim writer, Ziauddin Zardar, broadly pronounced that the life of Muhammad is known as the Sirah and was lived in the full light of history. Even in John's time, however, the first Sirah by Ibn Ishaq has not yet been written. It is possible, since Ibn Ishaq died in 676, 767, that some other written stories were already circulating about Muhammad during John's lifetime. There were later collected by writers like Ibn Hisham d. 833, who states that he incorporated a recension of Ibn Ishaq's biography in his own book. These are, however, all over 130 years after the death of Muhammad. Also, if Muhammad lived in the full light of history, why do we have virtually nothing from Muslim sources pertaining to Muhammad before the time of Caliph Abdul Malik R. 685 705, nearly 70 years after the death of Muhammad. This is one of the central problem areas raised by the neo-revisionists. Some neo-revisionists like Yehuda Nevo, even though whether Muhammad was an actual historic figure, for he can only be traced back historically to around 72 691, when his name appears on a coin minted by Abdul Malik. Nevo also believes that the few missing references to him in earlier literary sources should be regarded as later interpolations by copyists who knew the traditional account. In other words, it is difficult to explain how the central figure in a widely successful religious conquest could avoid the full light of history until the time he is needed as a focal point in a religion that is also the best for the government. On the other hand, Michael Cook concludes that the non-Muslim sources give enough of a picture of the first 70 years to indicate that Muhammad not only existed, but that he was a leader in a movement that started around AD 622. Even Patricia Khan, who once said that Muhammad did not exist as an historical figure, has changed her mind enough to say that Muhammad is clearly an individual who changed the course of history. But she also points out that we do not know how much of the Islamic tradition about him is true. Part of the problem is that the biographies, as well as the older literary material written about Muhammad by Muslims in the late 8th and 9th centuries, were mostly constructed from the from the only literary sources from the literary source that may have existed, at least in part, before the end of the 7th century, which was the Quran. In the next section, we will consider the development of the Quran, but suffice it to say at this point that if the earliest biographical literature on Muhammad were derived from exegetical explanations of the obscure narratives in the Quran, and then parts of the Quran were written in order to give a history to a new religious movement, then how do we get at any kernel of truth, much less an understanding of which events were played out under the full light of history? Hoyland also finds it very curious that, aside from the early non-Muslim sources before H. 72, the archaeological record is strangely silent about Islam, as well as Muhammad and the Quran. In fact, it really is not until 691 that we have a firm archaeological attestation to Muhammad on a coin minted by Abdul Malik, as well as the inscription bearing Muhammad's name in the Dome of the Rock. Highland offers that it is of course true that only with the passage of time does a man become a hero and a book authoritative, but does not account for the abrupt way that Muhammad suddenly appears on the Arab scene. Is it possible then that Abdul Malik utilized Muhammad as a propaganda weapon in the bid to make his new government more legitimate through an appeal to a religion, a prophet, and a scripture? By the time John of Damascus was writing about Muhammad in the 730s, Muhammad was considered to be an historical figure, but how much of his image of Muhammad had been created by the narratives that were probably circulating at the time, as well as the strong propaganda that had been in place at least from the time of Abdul Malik. John called Muhammad a false prophet, and he called the religion of his followers a heresy. He also ridiculed the so-called writings that came down to Muhammad from heaven. How closely does John's view of Muhammad corroborate with the evidence assembled by the neo-revisionists? Is it possible to reconstruct the first 100 years of Islam from a distance of 1,400 400 years, the formation of intermediate monotheism, as John of Damascus demonstrated in his writings against what he saw as a heresy of Christianity. There was a need to prepare Christians to defend their beliefs against the new religious doctrine that was assailing the Christian church throughout the Middle East. Leading up to John's time, some neo-revisionist scholars proposed that there, there was an intermediate monotheism forming from an amalgamation of Jewish and Christian influences. Over time, because of heretical and anti-orthodox monophysite, Nestorian and Arian beliefs, which were further influenced by rabbinic Judaism, this monotheistic movement incorporated a strong animosity for fundamental Christian doctrines such as the deity of Christ and the Trinity. Others found that Islam was in a sense a tribal conspiracy against the Byzantine and Persian empires with deep roots in Judaism, and that Arabs and Jews were allies in these conquering communities. They would claim that a stronger rabbinic Jewish element pushed the agenda at first, but as the conquest started up, the Jews were also a marginalist and in the time vilified in later writings even more than the Christians. Some even argue that it was the Arab religion that developed the most as it came in contact with the more divine social, culture and religious institutions of the conquered territory. Berker even argues that Islam is not understandable outside the influence of Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, neo-revisionists claim that it is from these two religious influences that Islam derived a good deal of its religious ideas and the vocabulary which, with which it was able to communicate to the inhabitants of the conquered lands. Berker also indicates that there was a general understanding in the first 50 years that Islam was merely a continuation of Judaism. One example given is that when the Dome of the Rock was built, people saw it as a rebuilding of the ancient temple. Even Ibn Warak relates the once bro argued that Islam emerged only when it came into contact with and under the influence of rabbinic Judaism. Certainly, each culture influenced the other, but since Muhammad was not identified by the Muslim until AD 691, and the religion was not defined theologically and scripturally until the end of the 8th century, some of the neo-revisionists, such as Yehuda Nevo, prefer to call the developing religion an intermediate monotheism. While supporting some aspects of Nevo's intermediate monotheism, Robert Holland questions Nevo's interpretation of 7th century rock inscriptions to support claims of a Judeo-Christian basis for Islam. Holland posits that to say that the inscriptions lack typical Islamic expressions or exhibit indeterminate monotheism just because they do not mention Muhammad is to misconstrue Islam, which is not primarily Muhammadanism, but rather subordination to an omnipotent and unique God. So the very common formula, though not incompatible with Judaism or Christianity, can nevertheless be said to be specifically Islamic. Highland then gives three reasons for the significance of these early inscriptions. They are in Arabic, they are in Semkufic script, and they draw upon a common stock of words and phrases. As an example, Hoyland then shows how the phrase forgive his former and his later sins is found as early as AD 688 683 in southwest Iraq, and then throughout the Middle East for the next 12 centuries. However, we have the same phenomenon today with the phrase such as rest in peace. It has been used throughout the world. Ubiquity doesn't necessarily denote distinctiveness. Even when he realized that the primary source upon which early Arab inscriptions draw upon in the Quran, he overlooks the possibility that the many variations and eclectic blends of words and phrases taken for different verses of the Quran may also suggest pre-Quranic sayings or verses from other sources such as Christian Syriac liturgy or Jewish Targums. Certainly, there was a tremendous mix of political and religious contrasts taking place at this time. Douglas Pratt, Douglas Pratt suggests that this suggests that into this context there erupted a brash and bold new religious movement apparently proclaiming the same monotheism but vehemently eschewing the Christocentrism of the faith into whose territories and communities its early expression made dramatic inroads. The traditional view claims that Muhammad and the Quran were responsible for this religious upheaval, and many Western scholars have accepted this picture as a factual representation of the events of the close of the 7th century. On the other hand, Nevo, who says that neither the traditional view of the Muslims nor the Western view is correct, have offered up a third interpretation. He says that in the third decade of the 7th century, Arab tribesmen took possession of the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire. This would appear to be no mean feat. And the obvious question is, why did they win? The classical Muslim literature portrays a series of pitched battles against the forces of a mighty power and ascribes the Arab success to their newfound faith. They won, in short, because God was on their side. The current Western version suggests that the Arabs won because the Byzantine Empire had been weakened and impoverished, first by Justinian's partially successful but exhausting attempts to regain the western provinces, and then by the Persian wars of the early 7th century. Heraclius conquered the Persians but was left in no state to withstand the Arabs. Archaeological work over the past decade and a half, together with evidence from literary sources, suggests that neither of these views is accurate. Nevo goes on to say that the Byzantine leaders had already decided to pull out of the Arabian lands and to not defend them militarily, but rather to transfer the control to Arab tribes which had become allies during the long occupation. This worked for a while, but problems came when the Byzantine government decided to cut off the subsidies to these allies. Without the needed income, the reluctant allies began to look for other sources of income. Some turned back to raiding other Arab tribes. In time, they became more unified, perhaps under Muhammad and his new ideas, and they decided that the greater riches were to be found in the lands to the north where the Byzantine armies had pulled out and the cities were left defenseless. Thus, the Arab sweep of the middle decades of the 7th century were not defined by large armies clashing over the fate of the land, but rather by a type of emigration or exodus, also known as Hajj or even Hijrah, accompanied by local skirmishes and occasional raiding parties. In this way, most of the towns and cities of Syria and Iraq were conquered when they surrendered to the advanced parties of Arab Maghazi warriors seeking easy booty in Texas. Even the great city of Damascus was handed over peacefully when John of Damascus' grandfather Mansur ibn Sarjun, who was who was the master of the city, surrendered to the Arabs within a fight. The new rulers continued allowing the Byzantine administrators to run the country through, since the Arabs were unfamiliar with the task of running such a government. They even preferred to live in their garrison towns and remain aloof from the main operations of the cities as long as they received the benefit of the taxes. In time this changed, especially under the leadership of Abd al-Malik, and by the middle of the 8th century, most of the important administrative roles were in the hands of the Arabs and converts to Islam. During this time, in the second half of the 7th century, when the Arabs kept to themselves in garrison towns and only carried on raids from these central points, Niveau concludes that the intermediate monotheism was mostly practiced by the elite. The Arab masses were still mostly pagan, and their forces were mixed with Christian, Persian, and other foreign soldiers who were mostly out for the booty, or have been captured and forced to fight as slaves. In areas where the majority was made up of the Arabs, the prior citizens were often forced to adopt the religion of the invaders. Nevo states, however, that the reason was not missionary zeal on the part of invading Arabs, but a political decision to encourage assimilation of all Arabs, old and new, into a uniform population. The emphasis seems to be on the fact that the general religion of the Arabs was a form of paganism, not of an earlier form of Islam. This was not true in regard to the elite, who for political reasons had accepted a form of monotheism. Even too early, through the leadership of Muawiyah and Abdul Malik, this intermediate monotheism developed into the all-encompassing religion of Islam. According to some of the neo-revisionists, Muawiyah was the first bona fide Arab leader and caliph, and it was under his leadership that the Arabs were first unified. Then, through concerted efforts, they solidified the control over the land that they conquered. Muawiyah is the first Arab leader to appear on a coin bearing his name to the appellation Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the believers, on one side, and the phrase Bismillah, in the name of Allah, on, on the reverse. The striking of a coin is usually a political statement demonstrating political control or the advent of a new regime, but it is questionable as to whether Muawiyah's reign was anything other than a loose confederation of Arab tribes or political independent community of Mu'minun believers. Jeremy Jones argues that a centralist administrative and fiscal apparatus is absent under Muawiyah and is first introduced under Abdul Malik and his successors. Hoyland counters Jeremy Jones' idea that there was only a loose tribal organization before Abdul Malik, but his evidence is mostly striking of coins. Under Muawiyah, Muhammad and the Quran are not mentioned, even as nascent religious views. This is not from uh, not from a lack of power under Muawiyah, but perhaps due to the very nature of the religion of the time. The real question is, even if Muawiyah had a powerful centralist government in place, why there is no mention at all of Muhammad, the Quran, or the religion of Islam, it is clear from the non-Muslim sources that some type of the Arab cult was in place during the time of Muawiyah, and it is also clear from the archaeological sources that it was not publicly proclaimed until the rule of Abdul Malik, who could possibly account for such an oversight. Perhaps the reason is that Islam was not yet a developed religion separate from Christianity and Judaism, but rather an amalgamation of various beliefs that were beginning to be defined under Muawiyah and Abdul Malik. This may be why the Arabs were called mu'minun, believers, without a mention as to what they believe. This may also be why John of Damascus, almost 50 years later, still considered the beliefs of the Ismailites to represent the heresy of Christianity rather than a religion distinct from his own faith. It all starts with Abdul Malik. Why then are the proclamations by Arabs concerning Islam and Muhammad absent before the last decade of the 7th century? Jeremy Jones believes that it is because there was no centralist government and no Muslim state before Abdul Malik. Under Muawiyah, life went on as usual. The administrations were still for the most part left intact under the Byzantine administrators, and the believers were mostly in garrison towns. This could have been, as Jones points out, because Muawiyah still did not have control over all the tribes of Arabia. This apparently changed under Abdul Malik 685-705, and once Abdul Malik established firm control over the region and squelched the rebellions of rival leaders such as Ibn al-Zubayr, it is possible he would have released that in order to have a credible government in the midst of the other monotheistic faiths, he needed a formalized religion, a scripture, and a prophet. Indeed, Hoyland picks up on this and concludes that it was pressure from rebel factions that induced Abdul Malik to proclaim Islam publicly as the ideological basis of the Arab state. This gave him the opportunity to rally the forces around him and bring unity in the midst of strife. Hoyland even says that he stole the thunder from his opponents, strengthened his own legitimacy, and allowed him and his successors to style themselves as God's deputies on earth with the right and responsibility to determine matter of religion. These earliest declarations of Islam, for example, are found during the time of Abdul Malik, but not beforehand. These coins, documents, and monumental inscriptions give testimony to a government claiming divine authority, religious writings that proclaim dominion over all other religions, and a prophet who claims to be the seal of all prophets. According to this view, the minting of coins under Abdul Malik was used to solidify his position as commander of the believers and to also produce a new Arab identity. His coins were inscribed into the words, "In the name of God, there is no God but God alone. Muhammad is the messenger of God." However, the coins from 691 up to 699 still had images of the Caliph. After that time, there were only words. He slid a epigraphic coin with the bold proclamation that Allah was the only God and Muhammad was his prophet. Not only encapsulated the core beliefs of the new religion, but it also became the mode of Islamic coinage from the next half millennium. This construction of the Dome of Rock began in the year 692, also solidified Abdul Malik's position and gave a voice to the movement. According to the neo-revisionist view, this mosque, built on the former site of the Jerusalem Temple, not only provided a worship center for the intermediate monotheism, which was not breaking free from its Jewish and Christian roots, but it was also a strong symbolic act to demonstrate that the new religion had mounted the former and had reclaimed victory. Deky mentions that the Dome of the Rock marks an important stage in the crystallization of a distinctly Islamic identity, even though it incorporates much in the way of Byzantine architectural motifs and was in fact built with the help of Byzantine craftsmen. The inscriptions emblazoned on the walls represent the earlier compilation of Quranic-like verses, and together with the adoption of Muhammad as the prophet, they physically first signaled the formation of the new state religion. Is it possible that the scenario of the development of an intermediate monotheism, as outlined above, is the most comprehensible and probable judgment on the issues? After all, this view seems to coincide with many of the 7th century non-Muslim eyewitness accounts. It also supported by the archaeological, epigraphic and numismatic evidence from the time period. Furthermore, it fits with John's assessment of Muhammad in the incomplete nature of the scriptures and the heretical nature of the religion. How then do these things help us understand John the Third? Thus, the forensic evidence presented by the neo-revisionists dovetail with John's own assessment. Are the eyewitness accounts from the 7th and early 8th centuries echoed in John's own eyewitness account from his position in the Umayyad court? And finally, how does John's own understanding help us understand early Islam better? Does his trained theological intellect allow us to take a snapshot of Islam in the middle of the 8th century, from which we will then be able to connect even more pieces of the puzzle? What do we see of Islam through the eyes of John? Now, what we have explored possible explanations for the formation of Islam based on various forms of evidence. Let us now consider another important area for providing context, which is the development of Islamic theology.